The courtroom was full of people, everyone whispering and shifting in their seats as they waited for the session to begin. The sound of papers shuffling, footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and the low hum of voices made the room feel alive. At the front sat the judge, a man with sharp eyes and a cold smile. He carried himself with arrogance like he believed he was untouchable. His gavel rested on the desk, a tool he often used not just for order, but for control. Among the crowd walked in a man who did not seem to belong to such a tense and hostile place. It was Keanu, dressed in a plain dark suit. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. He wore no jewelry, no signs of wealth except for one thing. Around his neck hung a simple silver cross. It was small, but the way it caught the light made it noticeable. People recognized him immediately. Whispers spread like wildfire. "That's Keanu Reeves," some murmured. Others leaned closer to get a better look. Surprised faces turned, for they did not expect to see such a world-famous actor sitting quietly in a courtroom. Keanu moved with humility, not demanding attention. He found a seat toward the front and bowed his head slightly as if in silent prayer or reflection. He wasn't there to shine, he was there for a purpose. Yet the judge's eyes found him, and from that moment the atmosphere changed. The judge leaned back in his chair and smirked. His voice carried loudly across the room. Well, even Hollywood wants to play at being holy in my court," he said with a mocking tone. He pointed directly at the small silver cross around Keanu's neck. "Tell me, Mr. Reeves, does that charm make you believe you are better than others?" The crowd grew silent. The insult was sharp, cruel, and unnecessary. Some people looked down in discomfort, while others looked at Keanu with pity. They waited to see if he would react with anger or shame. But Keanu did not. He lifted his head slowly, his calm eyes meeting the judge's. He did not raise his voice, nor did he snap back with harsh words. Instead, he simply said, "This cross reminds me to stand with those who cannot stand alone." His words were quiet, but in the still courtroom, they carried weight. The judge laughed, slamming his gavel once. "Stand with those who cannot stand alone," he repeated. Mockingly, "This is a court of law, not a church sermon. Save your little speeches for the movies." His laughter rang out, and the sound was bitter. He thought he had humiliated Keanu. He thought mocking the cross would show his superiority, but Keanu did not falter. He looked back down, his hands folded gently. He was not embarrassed, not shaken. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. The people in the room noticed it. Some who had doubted him before now saw him differently. His calmness was not weakness, it was strength. The family sitting just a few rows behind him, an ordinary family who had been crushed by unfair rulings and false judgments, looked at Keanu with hope. They knew why he was there. He had come to support them, to stand beside them in a place where they had no voice. And though the judge mocked, Keanu's presence gave them courage. The judge, however, could not stop himself. He leaned forward, tapping his gavel with a smirk. "Faith and kindness," he said, "are useless in this room. The only thing that matters here is power, and I have it." His arrogance filled the air, but the silence from Keanu remained unbroken. That silence unsettled many people in the room. Some began recording quietly on their phones, sensing that something important was unfolding. The tension grew heavy. The judge, in mocking Keanu's cross, had revealed not just his cruelty but also his pride. The crowd shifted uncomfortably and whispers began again. Some murmured that it was wrong to insult a man's faith like that. Others whispered that maybe the judge was trying too hard to cover something. Keanu sat there, his silver cross glinting faintly, a symbol of quiet resistance. He didn't need to fight with insults or rage. His presence alone spoke volumes. The judge thought he had made Keanu small, but the truth was the opposite. The more the judge mocked, the more he showed his own weakness. In that first moment, the stage was set. The courtroom was no longer just a place for law. It had become a stage for truth to reveal itself. The crowd did not know it yet, but the man who mocked the cross would soon face the weight of his own sins, and the quiet man who wore it would be remembered for standing with dignity when others might have broken. The air in the room was thick with suspense. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen. The mocking words of the judge echoed. But they would not last long. Soon the laughter would fade, and the sound of handcuffs would replace it. But for now, the moment lingered. Keanu sat still, the cross shining against the darkness of the courtroom, and everyone who watched would never forget the calm strength he carried that day. The judge was still smirking when the next case was called, but the courtroom had changed without him noticing. The air was different now, heavier, filled with tension. People whispered to each other, glancing at Keanu. Some leaned forward, trying to see if he would stay calm under more pressure. The family he had come to support sat upright, their hope growing with every passing second. They had never imagined that someone like Keanu Reeves would stand with them. And now, his presence made their fear shrink just a little. The judge tapped his gavel again, trying to regain control. "Next case," he barked, his voice sharp, but the confidence behind it was weaker than before. The next case was about a local man, an ordinary citizen who had been wrongly accused of fraud. His life had been turned upside down, his family humiliated, and his reputation ruined by false claims. He sat at the defendant's table, wringing his hands nervously, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for a miracle, and maybe unknowingly he had found one in the man sitting a few rows ahead. Keanu did not move immediately. He watched carefully, observing the people, the judge, the lawyers, and even the security guards. His calm gaze seemed to say that he understood everything not in words but in presence. The defendant looked at him with wide eyes, hope flickering, unsure if it was foolish or real. Keanu's quiet courage already spoke louder than any legal arguments could. The prosecutor began. A man known for his sharp tongue and relentless pursuit of convictions. He laid out the case with confidence, expecting an easy victory. He mocked the defendant quietly under his breath, assuming the audience would agree. The judge nodded along, his smirk returning, thinking the courtroom was firmly in his control. But with each word, the tension in the room grew. The prosecutor did not know that he was speaking in a space already charged with truth and integrity. Keanu leaned slightly forward, his hand brushing against the cross around his neck. A small movement, almost unnoticeable, but it radiated calmness and strength. The family behind him noticed it, and a sense of reassurance spread like warmth through their fear. The defendant's shoulders relaxed slightly as if he could finally breathe again. The energy in the room shifted, the power dynamic starting to tilt. The prosecutor presented his evidence, all papers and charts meant to intimidate, meant to overwhelm the court and crush the defendant. But Keanu's presence reminded everyone, silently, that justice was more than just paper and authority. The crowd began to murmur softly, some noticing the tension in the judge's face. Some even took out their phones, recording quietly. Sensing that the courtroom drama was turning into something bigger than any ordinary trial, then the judge, growing impatient with the murmurs, banged his gavel, trying to silence the whispers. "Order in the court," he shouted. But the sound fell flat. His authority was no longer unquestioned. Something had changed. The judge was no longer the center of control. Keanu's quiet dignity had shifted the energy in the room, and everyone felt it. The defendant finally found his voice, his hands trembling. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at the judge, "I am innocent. I have proof, but I was ignored." His words were strong, but the way he spoke carried fear, doubt, and years of frustration. The judge scoffed, rolling his eyes, ready to dismiss him with a wave of the gavel. But before he could, Keanu stood, slow, deliberate, and calm, drawing everyone's attention. He walked toward the defendant, his presence commanding the room without anger or arrogance. He spoke softly but firmly. "This man tells the truth, and his life deserves fairness. The law is not about mocking or power. It is about protecting those who cannot protect themselves." His words were not loud, but they hit the room with force. They reached the ears of the jury, the lawyers, and even the security. The crowd leaned forward, listening, inspired by the sincerity and simplicity of his statement. The judge's smirk faltered, his face tightening. He realized that he was losing the room, that his control was slipping. The people who had laughed and whispered were now fully focused on Keanu, their respect for him growing with every word. They saw someone who did not use fame for selfish reasons. Someone who risked standing in a courtroom to defend a stranger. Someone who showed that kindness and courage could shake even the most arrogant. The prosecutor's voice faltered as he tried to argue, his confident words failing against the calm force of Keanu's presence. The defendant's lawyer, inspired, began speaking more boldly, citing evidence and making clear arguments. The courtroom started to lean toward truth, not power, not fear. The murmurs grew louder, support for the defendant spreading. People who had felt powerless began to believe that fairness could exist, that someone could fight for them, that justice was possible. The tension was palpable, the courtroom waiting for the next move. The judge tapped his gavel again, but now it was nervous, unsure, his arrogance fading, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of worry. The power he thought he had was slipping from his hands, all because one man, quiet, humble, and steadfast, had reminded everyone that the law was meant to serve the people, not mock them. By the end of that part of the trial, the room had changed. Completely. The fear that had gripped the defendant and his family began to ease. A new energy filled the space, respect and hope replacing dread and doubt. And Keanu, sitting quietly with his cross, had done more than speak. He had shifted the balance of courage and fairness, showing that even in a place dominated by arrogance, a single act of standing with truth could make a difference. Outside the courtroom, the news about Keanu's quiet stand began to spread. Videos taken by people in the audience were already circulating online. Some clips showed the judge mocking Keanu's cross. Others captured Keanu's calm reply. Social media lit up with comments. Some praised his dignity. Others questioned the judge's behavior. But inside the courthouse, something much bigger was starting to build. Something hidden for years. In a small room not far from the courtroom, two journalists sat watching the live stream. One of them, Maria, had been investigating the judge for almost a year. She had seen reports of families losing everything, people who never got justice, and cases where clear evidence had somehow vanished. But she had never been able to fully prove anything. The judge was smart. He covered his tracks well, until today. Look. At that, Maria said, pausing the video where the judge mocked the cross. He's getting sloppy, that confidence. That's the kind people get right before they fall. Her partner nodded. You think he knows Keanu's not just here for moral support? Maria shook her head slowly. No, I don't think he has a clue. But something's going on. Keanu doesn't just walk into courtrooms without a reason. What Maria didn't know yet was that Keanu had quietly been helping people affected by this judge's corrupt rulings. Over the years, several people had come to him. People with no money, no lawyers, and no hope. Keanu didn't advertise. He didn't want credit. But every time he heard about injustice, especially when the system failed the poor or the voiceless, he quietly helped behind the scenes. He had paid for lawyers, arranged housing for families torn apart by false rulings, and in some cases, helped reopen investigations that had been closed too quickly, and all of it somehow connected back to this same judge. The judge, meanwhile, sat back in his office during the recess, sipping his coffee and chuckling to himself. These celebrities think their name means something in here, he muttered. This is my court, not Hollywood. His assistant entered, eyes wide. Sir, have you seen this? She asked, holding up her tablet. On the screen were the viral videos, millions of views already pouring in. The comments were brutal, people calling for investigations, people quoting Keanu's quiet words. The judge's smile slowly faded. This doesn't mean anything, he said, though his voice shook just a little. People forget things by tomorrow. But he knew better. His past wasn't clean, and it wouldn't take much for people to start looking where they shouldn't. Back in the courtroom, the trial continued, but whispers grew louder. More people now knew about the rumors of the judge's favoritism, his strange rulings, and the people who always seemed to lose under his hand. Keanu said nothing more, but his silence continued to speak loudly. The family he came to support watched him closely, their respect turning into awe. They remembered how, just weeks ago, they had received an unexpected call, a quiet voice on the phone saying, "I heard about your case, I'd like to help." They thought it was a prank, but then a lawyer arrived, at their door, paid for and ready to work. And when they asked who had sent him, the lawyer just smiled and said, "A friend who believes in kindness." They never expected that friend to walk into the courtroom and sit quietly beside them. While the judge tried to move the case along, he noticed people's attention wasn't fully on him anymore. He slammed his gavel harder, gave longer speeches, and even raised his voice more than usual. But no one looked impressed. If anything, they looked suspicious. Outside the building, Maria and her partner approached a man who had once worked in the courthouse, a clerk who had lost his job suddenly 2 years ago. He agreed to meet them quietly. His face was nervous, his hands shaking. "I saw things," he whispered. "Case files disappearing, signatures forged, people who paid envelopes under the table." Maria leaned in. "Were those connected to Judge Halton?" The man nodded slowly. "Always. That was all she needed." She thanked him and rushed back to her car, dialing a contact at the state office. "You need to open an official investigation now," she said. "I've got witnesses, documents, and now, public pressure." Back in the courtroom, the judge's phone buzzed, a message from someone higher up. He glanced at it, and his face turned pale. The message was short, but it said everything. "You're under review, suspend rulings until further notice." He looked up from the phone and his eyes met Keanu's again. For the first time, there was no smirk, no confidence, just fear. Keanu did not smile. He only nodded once, as if to say, "The truth is coming." The family behind him had no idea what was happening yet, but they felt the change in the room. The way the judge sat suddenly straighter, quieter, almost cornered. Keanu leaned back in his seat, his hands resting calmly in his lap. The silver cross on his neck shimmered under the lights. The same cross that was mocked now felt like a sword of truth. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew. This was no longer just a trial. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The courtroom grew quieter as the session continued, but not because people were bored or tired. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone feels something big is about to happen. People were texting each other, recording with their phones in their laps, sharing updates online. No one had expected this court session to turn into something so serious. They came for a trial, but now it felt like history was being made. Keanu still sat quietly in his seat. He hadn't spoken since his earlier words, but his calm presence hadn't faded. In fact, it was growing stronger. The judge avoided looking at him now, pretending to read files and glance at papers, but his hands trembled just a little every time he lifted his gavel. Outside the courtroom, things were moving fast. Maria, the journalist who had been following the judge's trail for months, was finally getting the help she needed. The man who used to work as a courthouse clerk had agreed to hand over copies of old files he had secretly kept, documents that showed clear signs of case tampering and forgery. At the same time, a tech expert had reached out. He had worked briefly with the court's internal system and still had access to logs and backups. He claimed he had found records of emails between the judge and private parties, emails that discussed payment for favorable rulings. Maria listened carefully, taking notes. Her heart was racing, but she remained focused. "Send everything to the state legal board now," she told the man. "This judge's time is up." Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the judge began to lose his cool. He raised his voice again, not out of confidence but frustration. The prosecutor kept glancing at his phone, his expression uneasy, as if he too had seen the growing storm outside. The energy in the room had changed completely. The judge was no longer in charge, not truly. Keanu leaned toward the defendant, whispered a few quiet words. The man nodded slowly, encouraged by the support. The family behind them smiled for the first time in days. They still didn't know all the details, but they felt protected. It was the kind of feeling they hadn't known in a long time. Hope, the air. Judge tried to regain control by speeding through the arguments, ignoring key points and silencing the defense lawyer whenever he could. But each time he did, more people looked uncomfortable. A woman in the audience whispered to her friend, "Why is he so nervous? He wasn't like this before." Others were thinking the same. Something was off, and the crowd could feel it. Then came the moment that would change everything. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened and two men in suits walked in. They were investigators from the State Ethics Committee. Their presence was quiet but powerful. They didn't interrupt. They simply sat down, opened their folders, and began to take notes. The judge saw them and his face changed. All the color drained from it. He paused in the middle of a sentence, cleared his throat, and looked down. But the courtroom noticed. Phones came back out, people whispered again. Keanu glanced at the two men, gave a respectful nod, and returned his focus to the trial. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone could see now. This wasn't just a visit from a famous actor. This was part of something bigger, something that had been planned, quietly, patiently, carefully. The judge tried to continue as if nothing had changed, but he stumbled through his words. He started repeating points, misreading documents, even calling the wrong names. The prosecutor looked confused, unsure of what to do. Then the defense lawyer stood up, his voice calm but confident. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that the trial be paused, given the presence of state observers and the unusual events surrounding this case." The judge hesitated. "That won't be necessary," he said, trying to keep control, but his voice cracked slightly. One of the investigators spoke for the first time. "We'll be reviewing this case in detail. We suggest all proceedings be recorded and submitted for further examination." It wasn't a request. It was a warning. The judge had no choice. He nodded stiffly. "Very well," he said, trying to hide the sweat on his brow. He banged his gavel. Short recess. As he stood and left through the side door, the crowd erupted into whispers. Some clapped quietly, others just smiled at each other. Keanu remained seated, peaceful as ever. His cross caught the light again, and a young boy in the audience pointed at him, whispering, "He's not just a movie star, he's a real hero." Outside, reporters had already gathered, Maria among them. She now had everything she needed to break the story wide open. The courthouse that had once silenced. The poor was now the center of a truth that could not be hidden anymore. The judge didn't know it yet. But his secrets were no longer buried. The files were in the hands of the right people. The videos were in the hands of the public. And Keanu's quiet stand had become a symbol of something far greater than one case. It was the return of justice. And it had started with kindness. The courtroom slowly filled again after the short recess. But this time the energy was completely different. People walked in with wide eyes, whispering about the two investigators in suits. Some had seen them enter. Others had read the news updates online during the break. It was now public. An official investigation had begun against the judge. Keanu sat quietly, still in the same seat. His hands were folded in his lap, and the silver cross around his neck gently reflected the soft lights above. The family behind him looked more relaxed now, their eyes full of hope. The defendant, once shaking with fear, now sat straighter. His lawyer had returned with a new level of confidence. But the judge, when he came back through the side door, looked like a different man. His face had turned pale. The usual smirk was gone. He tried to walk with his usual pride, but his steps were slower, heavier. He sat down and cleared his throat, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "We will now continue," he said. But even that sounded forced. The crowd watched him carefully. Every movement he made was now under a microscope. People no longer feared him. They were watching him like someone waiting to see what cracks would form next. Even the court staff exchanged looks. Some had worked under him for years, but now they were seeing him as if for the first time. As the trial continued, the defense lawyer began asking questions the judge didn't expect. Questions about evidence that had gone missing in previous hearings. He brought up names of other families who had suffered under this same court. The judge tried to object, but his words were clumsy. The prosecutor remained silent, clearly shaken. Then it happened again. The judge suddenly raised his voice at Keanu, pointing directly at the cross around his neck. "You think that cross gives you power in here?" he snapped. "This is still my courtroom." Gasps came from the audience. People were stunned. He was doing it again, mocking someone's faith, trying to use fear to control the room. But Keanu remained calm. He slowly stood up, not to argue, but to address the court. "I did not come here for power," he said softly. I came to remind you what justice is supposed to look like. That cross is not about me. It's about standing beside people who have been forgotten." His voice was calm, steady, and full of quiet strength. No anger, no pride, just truth. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of the investigators stood up. He walked toward the bench and handed the judge a sealed envelope. The judge looked down at it, then back at the investigator. "What is this?" he asked, though his voice was shaking. "A formal notice," the man said. "You're now officially under suspension. All rulings from this point forward will be monitored by an oversight board." The room froze. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. The judge looked stunned, for the first time truly speechless. His hands trembled as he held the envelope. You can't do this now," he whispered, but the words had no power. The second investigator stepped forward. "We can, and we will." The judge stood, trying to keep his pride, but everyone could see he was unraveling. His pride had become his weakness, and now it was being pulled apart in front of the very people he once mocked. Keanu stepped aside, letting the moment happen. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just stood with respect for the process he believed in. The family behind him quietly wept, not out of fear but relief. Justice had entered the room at last. As the judge was asked to step down from the bench, the crowd couldn't stay silent anymore. Some clapped softly. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The courtroom that once felt like a prison now felt like a place of hope. The prosecutor tried to end the session quickly, but the investigators weren't done. They called forward the former court clerk who had spoken to the reporters. He confirmed what many feared. Cases had been changed, evidence had been buried, and decisions had been bought. People listened in shock. Some had lost loved ones to these unfair rulings. Some had spent years in jail. Now they realized it wasn't just bad luck. It was corruption, and Keanu had been the spark that lit the fire. He walked over to the family and placed a gentle hand on the father's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. Outside the courtroom, the media waited. Microphones, flashing cameras, live streams. The world wanted to know what had happened inside, but Keanu didn't go to the cameras. He walked past them, helping the family out through the side exit. No interviews, no speeches, he came to help, and he had done it. The cross that had been mocked was no longer just jewelry. It had become a symbol of courage, of standing for others, even when it's difficult. And as the judge sat alone in his office, his world falling apart, he finally understood. It wasn't fame or money that changed the room, it was character, it was kindness. And that he could never fake. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned gray. A soft wind blew through the city streets as if nature itself could feel the storm that had just passed inside the courtroom. Reporters stood in groups, cameras ready, trying to catch a glimpse of Keanu or the suspended. Judge, police vehicles, and black government cars surrounded the building. It was no longer a simple trial. It had become national news. But Keanu didn't care about attention. He stood in a small waiting room inside the courthouse, speaking softly with the family he had come to support. The father wiped tears from his eyes. The mother held her child close. They couldn't stop thanking him, but Keanu gently shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," he said kindly. "I only did what anyone should do." The young girl looked up at him, her eyes wide. "But why did you help us?" she asked. "You didn't even know us." Keanu knelt down and gave her a small smile. "Because no one should feel forgotten. Not in a world where we all share the same sky." At that moment, it was clear. This wasn't about being a celebrity, or being rich or powerful. Keanu had done everything quietly from his heart. His strength came not from fame, but from a deep understanding of right and wrong. Meanwhile, the judge sat alone in a private holding room, his head in his hands. He was no longer surrounded by respect or fear. His phone had been taken, his gavel removed. For the first time in years, he was just a man facing the consequences of his actions. Voices from the hallway reached his ears. Reporters talking about his suspension, lawyers speaking about retrials, and worst of all, someone mentioned a full audit of his past 10 years on the bench. He tried to breathe slowly. but panic tightened in his chest. He thought he was untouchable. He thought mocking Keanu and his cross would be harmless. He thought the system would always protect him, but he was wrong. In another part of the building, Maria, the journalist, met with 2 lawyers from the state investigation team. She handed over a small hard drive. "Here's everything," she said. "Emails, documents, statements from victims and witnesses. It's all organized." One of the lawyers nodded, impressed. "You've done a great service. This will change lives." Maria looked toward the courtroom. "It wasn't just me," she said. "None of this would have moved forward if Keanu hadn't shown up today. People needed someone to stand in the light so they'd stop fearing the dark." Back in the courtroom, the trial resumed, but this time with a substitute judge, a woman with a calm face and a firm voice. She reviewed the case quickly, asked a few sharp questions, and within an hour, the original trial was dismissed. The dire man who had been wrongly accused of fraud was now free. He broke down in tears, his lawyer hugging him tightly. The audience clapped softly, many wiping away tears. Keanu stood in the back watching quietly. He didn't move forward, didn't take credit. Instead, he gave the moment to the man who had suffered in silence for so long. Outside, when the news spread that the case had been dropped and the judge was officially under arrest, crowds began to gather. People came from nearby towns holding signs that read, "Justice matters," and "Truth wins." Some carried photos of their loved ones who had lost everything because of that same judge. Others simply came to say thank you to the man who reminded them that kindness could still break through corruption. As Keanu stepped outside with the family, the cameras flashed. Microphones were pushed toward him. "Mr. Reeves, can we get a statement? Why did you come today? Do you feel proud of what you did?" Keanu looked at the sea of faces and said just one sentence. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me." Then he gently guided the family toward a waiting car, letting them go first, protecting them even as the crowd grew louder. Inside the courthouse, the former judge sat with his hands cuffed, staring at the floor. His world had collapsed, not from war or violence, but from truth. He thought about the moment he mocked that silver cross, the way he tried to humiliate someone who had come in peace. He thought it was a joke, a chance to show off his power, but now that cross was all he could see in his mind. It haunted him. Not because it was magical, but because it reminded him of the man who stood with courage while he stood with fear. And the days that followed, investigations expanded. More corrupt officials were exposed, retrials were ordered, and people who had once lost faith in the system slowly began to believe again. Keanu refused all interviews. He turned down offers to turn the story into a film. Instead, he visited the families he had helped quietly, away from cameras, away from lights. And wherever he went, he carried that same silver cross, not as a symbol of fame, but as a reminder that standing up for others is always worth it, that even one kind act can change everything. 3 days had passed since the judge was taken away in handcuffs, but the impact of that courtroom moment was still shaking the city. News channels ran stories day and night. Headlines read things like "Celebrity helps expose corruption" and "The cross that brought justice." Social media was filled with clips of Keanu's calm speech, screenshots of the judge's shocked face, and comments from people around the world who now felt a little more hopeful about justice. But Keanu wasn't watching the news. He had returned to a quiet part of the city where the family lived, the same family he had stood by in court. Their apartment was small but clean, full of warmth. This time, he came not as a witness or supporter, but as a friend. The little girl ran to the door when she saw him. Her face lit up with joy. "You came back," she said, hugging him without hesitation. Keanu smiled and hugged her gently. "I promised, didn't I?" Inside, the father had just returned from a job interview, one arranged by a contact Keanu had spoken to. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was honest work, and it came with dignity. The man looked at Keanu with deep gratitude. "Because of you, I can start again," he said. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "You earned this. I just made sure someone noticed." While the world focused on the big courtroom drama, Keanu focused on what came after, the healing, the rebuilding. He believed justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was also about lifting up those who were crushed along the way. Meanwhile, the investigators kept digging. They found hidden bank accounts in the judge's name, traced backroom deals, and even discovered audio recordings where he promised certain rulings in exchange for favors. One of the most shocking recordings included him laughing and saying, "Everyone has a price. They just need to feel desperate enough." That sentence alone was enough to reopen over 40 past cases. People who had given up hope were now receiving calls from lawyers. Some wept on the phone, not believing it was real. In one small neighborhood, an elderly woman sat holding a letter. It said her son's case would be reviewed. Her son had been in prison for something he didn't do, and it was the same judge who had sentenced him. She looked at the TV where Keanu's photo appeared and whispered, "Thank you, whoever you are." Back in the city, Maria, the journalist, was honored with a press award for her brave reporting. But in her speech, she said something that made everyone pause. "I want to share this award with someone who didn't ask for credit." He walked into a courtroom with a silver cross and walked out having changed the system, not with anger, not with power, but with quiet strength. The room gave her a standing ovation, but Keanu wasn't there. He was sitting on a park bench across the street from a school, watching the children play. He looked tired but peaceful. A few people recognized him, but no one came too close. They respected the silence he carried, like a man who had seen both the worst and best of the world and was still choosing kindness. One of the boys playing nearby fell and scraped his knee. Keanu got up quietly, took a tissue from his pocket, and helped the child clean it. The boy thanked him shyly, not even knowing who he really was. That was how Keanu liked it. He knew that real change didn't come from fame. It came from showing up, from choosing to care when it was easier not to, from listening when others shouted, and from standing with those who had no one else. Later that evening, the city held a candlelight vigil outside the courthouse. People gathered holding small white candles. Some came for loved ones who had suffered injustice. Others came simply to say, "Thank you." The crowd grew larger as the sun set. There were no big speeches, just silence. Then a woman stepped forward and lit the first candle at the courthouse steps. It was the mother from the trial, the one Keanu had helped. She held her candle high and said, "This light is for those who were forgotten, but not anymore." More people lit candles, filling the stairs with tiny flames. Creating a river of light in the darkness in the distance, someone noticed a tall man standing under a tree. He wore a dark coat and a silver cross that glowed faintly in the soft candlelight. He didn't come forward, didn't take the stage, but he stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, watching the lights. And when a small child from the crowd looked up at him and said, "Are you him?" Keanu just smiled gently and replied, "I'm just someone who believes people deserve better." The boy nodded and ran back to his parents, never knowing how true those words were. That night, the courthouse didn't feel like a place of fear. It felt like hope. All because one man refused to walk away when things were wrong. All because he chose kindness over pride. And all because he carried a cross, not for decoration, but as a promise. Weeks had passed since the courtroom incident, but people were still talking about it. The story of the corrupt judge who mocked a silver cross and ended up in handcuffs had become more than just news. It had become a symbol, something real and powerful in a world where people often felt helpless. All across the city, people were waking up. Citizens started coming forward to report unfair rulings and lost cases. Lawyers who had stayed silent for years now spoke up, encouraged by what they had seen. The courthouse, once ruled by fear and silence, had become a place of honesty and hope. Keanu had returned to his normal life, or at least tried to. He didn't appear on TV, didn't give interviews, and refused every request to tell his side of the story. For him, it wasn't a performance. It was something personal. He still wore that same silver cross, not for attention, but as a reminder. A reminder that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And still, it moves mountains. The family he had helped was doing better. Now, the father had started his new job, the daughter was back in school, and the mother had begun volunteering at a local shelter to help other struggling families. They never forgot what Keanu did, but more importantly, they learned to believe in themselves again. One sunny afternoon, Keanu was walking through a quiet park when a man stopped him. The man looked nervous at first, but finally said, "You probably don't remember me, but I was in the courtroom that day." Keanu gave a gentle smile. "I remember faces, not names." "How are you doing?" The man nodded. "Better now. After seeing what you did, I decided to reopen my brother's case. He was wrongly sentenced 3 years ago, but now we've got a new hearing." Keanu's smile grew warmer. "I'm glad you didn't give up." The man looked down at the cross around Keanu's neck and said, "You reminded us that justice still matters even when it feels impossible." Keanu didn't say anything for a moment, then replied quietly, "Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up so others remember they can too." That night, Keanu returned to his small apartment. He lived simply, no grand mansion, no expensive cars, just peace. He made tea, sat by the window, and opened a letter that had arrived. Earlier that day, it was from the State Justice Board, thanking him for his role in exposing corruption. They offered him an honorary award and even invited him to speak at a legal reform event. But Keanu set the letter down and looked out at the stars. He wasn't interested in awards. He had already received the only reward that mattered. The truth had come out and good people had been given a second chance. Meanwhile, the former judge sat alone in a holding facility. His trial was coming up, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had no supporters left, no allies, only silence, and every night he thought about that cross, about how one man's quiet presence had brought everything down, not through power or threats, but through truth and kindness. Maria, the journalist, finally published a full-length article called "The Man with the Silver Cross." It was read by millions. She told the full story, not about a celebrity, but about a man who showed up when it mattered most. She ended the article with a powerful sentence. "Sometimes heroes don't come with capes or cameras. Sometimes they just walk in, sit quietly, and change everything." In a small school library, a teacher printed that article and pinned it to the wall. A boy who had always struggled to speak up in class stood reading it for 10 minutes straight. He didn't say anything to anyone, but that evening he went home and told his parents he wanted to become a lawyer one day. "To help people like that man did," he said softly. In a way, Keanu's actions had become a ripple, one that started in a courtroom but spread to streets, schools, families, and hearts. And somewhere on a quiet bench by a peaceful lake, Keanu sat again, feeding birds with a small paper bag in his hand. A young girl passing by smiled and said, "You look like the man from the courthouse story." Keanu looked at her, gave a gentle nod, and replied, "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just someone who believes everyone deserves fairness." The girl smiled and waved before running back to her parents. Keanu leaned back, watching the sky turn orange with the setting sun. No crowd, no applause, just peace. But the world had changed just a little, and it all began with a man, a courtroom, and a cross.